And my name is Brian Birch, and I serve as the director of the Religious Studies program here on campus. And I work with some wonderful friends and colleagues here, and I want to publicly thank everyone who's been associated with this event. The staff of the Center for the Study of Ethics, the Faculty Advisory Board, the participants, and all others. Thank you for being here and being part of this. So given our theme of democratic culture and religion, obviously the law bears on this topic. And some of you are aware that we convened a panel on Carson v. Makin during Ethics Awareness Week in September. And it was an abbreviated panel, and we all felt as if there was a need to continue the conversation. So you can call this the second installment of our discussion of this landmark Supreme Court case, which you'll be hearing more about from our panelists. So the First Amendment opens up by saying, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. And many of you know from your American heritage classes or political science classes, right, that the first of these is known as the Establishment Clause, and the second is known as the Free Exercise Clause. And how these clauses affect the happy, productive advancement of society is a question that's been present from the beginning, from the very foundations of the Bill of Rights. And some of you also know that a lot of these important Supreme Court cases having to do with the First Amendment center on education. And we could spend several more sessions talking about, right, how religious freedom issues and establishment issues have played out in terms of public education, right? And this is another one of these cases, this Carson v. Makin case, that will prove itself to be impactful, important, and it will be felt widely in coming months and years. So the way we're going to approach this session today is we have three specialists in First Amendment studies. You'll first hear from Robert Burton, who is going to give us historical context and perspective related to this case. Then you'll hear from Fred Gedicks, who will address legal interpretive issues related to the case. And last but not least, certainly, we'll hear from Eleesha Tucker, who is going to talk about the implications of Carson v. Makin for public education. And so to give you a sense of who is here on our panel, Robert Burton is the director of the Civic Thought and Leadership Initiative in the Center for Constitutional Studies here at UVU. His research and teaching focus on constitutional law, American political thought, and political philosophy. His specific specialties include, applicable to our panel today, First Amendment issues and the relationship between conscience and politics. And you see his interest being focused in a forthcoming book, which is titled A Conscience Safe for Politics, Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, and the Formation of the Modern Conscience. To Robert's right is Frederick Mark Gedicks, who is the Guy Anderson Chair and Professor of Law at Brigham Young University. In the law school there, he teaches constitutional law and legal theory. He is widely published, and I truly mean widely published, on a variety of issues related to First Amendment jurisprudence, but he mostly focuses on issues related to law and religion and constitutional interpretation. And to give you a sense for a couple of things that he has worked on and is working on, he was the counsel of record and the principal author of the amicus brief for the Burwell versus Hobby Lobby case, which is well known to people who pay attention to these things. Another interesting article that is in the works is entitled Custom, Preference, or Nature, Mormon Polygamy, Same-Sex Marriage, and Natural Law Theory, which I'm very interested to read, and many, many others that are too numerous to cite for our session here. Finally, Eleesha Tucker is the executive director of the Utah 3Rs Project. She teaches part-time here at UVU in the History and Political Science department. Her background lies in history and civics education, where she specializes in the ideals of liberty articulated in the American Revolution and the freedoms protected by the religion clauses of the First Amendment. She has been involved in a number of education projects related to these issues. She came to Utah from Washington, D.C. She's worked on projects in connection with the American Revolution Institute, the Constitutional Studies Project, the Freedom Forum First Amendment Center, and notably with the Civic Thought Leadership Initiative here at UVU, which we're all excited to be part of and to support. So without further ado, each of them will speak for roughly 12 to 15 minutes. We will have a short break, roughly at 10 minutes to 1, and then we will reconvene at 1 for a Q&A session until 1:30. So please be thinking of questions you might want to pose to the panelists. Please join me in welcoming each of them.
All right. Well, it is a pleasure to be here with you. Thank you to Professor Birch for this wonderful symposium on religion, culture, and diversity. I'm so glad that we do things like this here at UVU. As Brian mentioned, I will be offering a bit of the historical background, which is important even if you hear it twice. Is that better? Okay, good. So it's important even if you hear it twice. So if you were here for our last symposium, I'm afraid this will be a bit of a repeat, but I think the history is still the history, which means for those of you who weren't here, it's important that you understand at least the background of this case. So what we're focusing on is the Supreme Court case, Carson v. Makin. In very brief, and I mean very brief because Professor Gedicks is going to go into much greater detail, the state of Maine established a tuition assistance program for students to attend essentially private schools in rural areas without a public school available. So parents get to pick the private school and the state pays the school. Maine also has a law that says that tuition payments can only go towards what they call non-sectarian or non-religious schools. So the question, at least in part, that the court needed to address, was whether the state giving funds to private schools generally, but specifically prohibiting funds going to private religious schools, violates the religion clauses of the First Amendment. So that's the question at hand. If this statement of the case leaves you with more questions than it does answers, you're not alone. And so my hope is to give a bit of the background to help us understand what are the religion clauses of the Constitution, a little bit about how they work, and a little bit about why they matter to this case from the perspective, again, of history. And I'm really looking forward to Professor Gedicks, Professor Tucker's takes on the case itself and its implications. So, as Dr. Birch mentioned, the First Amendment reads, "Congress shall make no law regarding an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof." So we scholars who have way too much time on our hands to think about these things break these into two different distinct clauses. One is the Establishment Clause. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. And what we call the Free Exercise Clause. Congress shall make no law prohibiting the free exercise of religion. So the obvious next question is, what is an establishment of religion that Congress shall make no law about, and what is the free exercise of religion? Well, unfortunately, there aren't easy, clear-cut answers to this question, and the Supreme Court continues to debate these very questions. What does this mean? What does it mean in practice? Even among things like these most basic definitions about what is free exercise, what is establishment. In fact, the case that we're looking at today is very much a continuation of debates about the meaning of the clauses themselves in many ways. What we can do, though, is we can look back at history and say, okay, what at different times in history have these clauses meant? How have they been interpreted in the past? And so one of the places naturally to begin is at the time of the founding or the adoption of the First Amendment. In terms of free exercise, and again, this is going to have to be a bit of an oversimplification for the purpose of us being able to grasp the basic essence here. I'd love to teach a whole course on the First Amendment, and if we do, we'd spend days arguing about each of these definitions. But unfortunately, we can't do that today. At the time of the founding, I think it's safe to say everyone agreed that the free exercise clause, the free exercise of religion, meant that there could be no penalties for being religious or non-religious, right? No religious tests for office, for example. In England, for example, those of dissenting faiths had been persecuted, had been denied certain political rights. They're saying, not that here, right? That was the minimum that everyone, the consensus that everyone had. Free exercise was no penalty for being religious or for being non-religious. However, there were also areas of disagreement at the time of the founding. Some, like Madison, James Madison, for example, thought that government should apply no particular burdens to those of religious faith, but at the same time provide no particular exemptions from otherwise generally applicable laws. So, and some have called this a non-cognizance approach to religion. Religion does its thing, government does its thing, no specific burdens, no particular exemptions. Others, like George Washington, though, as he thought about what the free exercise of religion meant, believed that, quote, conscientious religious scruples should be treated with delicacy and tenderness and be extensively accommodated in the law. He was writing this to a congregation of Quakers who were pacifists. So this is coming from the general of the Revolutionary War to those Quakers, particularly in Pennsylvania, who were a large percentage of the population, who on religious grounds refused to participate in war, or at least at the very least refused to fight. And yet he still, given that background, after the revolution said that as much as possible, religious beliefs should be treated with delicacy and tenderness and be extensively accommodated, with an understanding that there had to be certain limits on that in the law. So again, that's a very different understanding of free exercise. So if we're trying to say, well, what at the time that this First Amendment was adopted was understood by free exercise, we can say, well, there's some things that were agreed upon, no penalties for religious belief, but other things that we disagreed. What about when a law burdens a person's religious belief? Madison said no exemptions. Washington said yes. And we can divide the framers into these camps and other subcamps. But I think these are pretty good polls to see the difference in the thought at the time. Well, in turning to the Establishment Clause, what was originally meant by the Establishment Clause? Again, I think it's fair to say that everyone agreed that meant no state church like the Church of England. That would mean no king, obviously, as head of the state church. It would also mean no Lord spiritual, right? In the House of Lords, even to this day, there are lords spiritual who sit and exercise temporal power. Well, clearly, that would be beyond the pale in this case. But beyond no state church, again, even those at the time of the amendment's adoption, there was debate about, well, what else? In particular, the question of what about state funds going towards religious education? And so again, we had framers that differed. Thomas Jefferson famously spoke in his letter to the Danbury Baptists in Virginia of a wall of separation between church and state. Right? So we have religion on one side, we have the state on the other, and there's this wall, this what later justices would call a high and impregnable wall of separation between church and state. And so they have different spheres, and any kind of intermingling or mixing of the two would constitute a violation of the Establishment Clause. That was Thomas Jefferson's opinion. Others, however, had different views. Patrick Henry famously proposed that tax funds be used for Christian education in Virginia. And we have John Adams in Massachusetts describing the state-established church, or the form of it in Massachusetts, as the most mild and equitable establishment of religion on the face of the earth. So again, we had different views when it came to, and in Massachusetts it was largely religious funds being used to support education. And so again, we have differing views, right, on the details of what no establishment of religion means. For someone like Jefferson or Madison, in responding to the debate in Virginia, state funds going towards providing a kind of religious education, well, that was a clear entanglement of religion that was inappropriate. But for others of the framers, state funds were not. However, as a matter of historical fact, that Virginia view became the predominant view of the Supreme Court. So in a case that addressed with issues here in Utah, Reynolds versus United States in 1879, the Supreme Court Chief Justice, Justice Waite, hadn't had much experience looking at the religion clauses because, as originally drafted, these religion clauses only applied to the federal government. Back in the day, the federal government was largely small. It was the state governments that really did a lot of the work of governing. And so the Supreme Court didn't have a lot of reasons to say, what do these clauses mean? Until Utah, which wasn't a state, it was a territory, had a case involving Mormon polygamy, and whether the Edmunds-Tucker Acts, laws that prohibited the practice of polygamy in the territories, whether they applied given the religious background of the Mormons in Utah. And so, as again, just kind of a historical quirk, Justice Waite went next door to his neighbor, who was an eminent Virginia historian, and said, well, what do these clauses mean? And he said, well, here's the Virginia experience, right? Here's James Madison's Memorial and Remonstrance. Here's Thomas Jefferson's Danbury Baptist letter in the Wall of Separation. So those became the Supreme Court's first early interpretations of the Establishment Clause. The problem with that is that it did ignore the rest of the experience in America at the time and the other views at the time. So it was a partially accurate but incomplete view, at least in terms of understanding what the clause originally meant. This was picked up later in the early 1900s by Justice Hugo Black in an important case called Everson versus Board of Education. But what had been originally a quirk, a historical quirk of going to your next door neighbor and focusing on the Virginia experience, by the time of Everson versus Board of Education, there were different reasons at play. For at least some of the Supreme Court justices, in particular Justice Hugo Black writing the decision, there was a deep interest in thickening that wall of separation between church and state because of an anti-Catholic bias in the United States. So beginning in the 1850s, there was a much larger number of Catholics in the United States, primarily from Ireland, but also from northern Germany and Poland and other places. And as they came in, there was this deep suspicion about whether Catholics could be good Americans. And so you had parties like the Know Nothing Party rise. There were anti-immigrant parties, but there was also a deep religious element here. That Catholics, there was a question of whether they could be good democratic citizens because they still had an allegiance, supposedly, in the rhetoric of the time, to a foreign potentate, right, to the papacy in Rome. And so especially among intellectual circles in the United States, as well as in various grassroots parties, there was this opposition to Catholic influence. And so part of that was Catholics said, well, we're going to form our own schools to avoid some of this persecution. But in doing so, Protestants were deeply concerned about state funds going towards Catholic schools. And so there was an effort to put amendments in state constitutions and eventually in the federal constitution to prohibit specifically state funds going to quote-unquote sectarian schools. Now the deep irony here is that the secular schools still had Bible reading of the King James Bible, they still had Protestant prayer, but that was acceptable, but Catholics receiving some kind of federal funding was not. And so this led to the passage of what were called Blaine Amendments. And this came from Congressman James G. Blaine in 1875 proposed a constitutional amendment to the federal constitution prohibiting state funds from going to religious schools. And it was supported by Ulysses S. Grant, President of the United States, among many others. It ended up being passed overwhelmingly in the House, but lost in the Senate by a handful of votes and never became constitutional law. However, many states adopted it. In fact, the federal government later required new states, like the state of Utah, for example, and others in the West, to adopt Blaine amendments in order to gain statehood. It became a statehood requirement. So that gets us to the case before us today. There's still deep debate running all the way to the 2000s about whether state funds that end up in the hands of religious schools violate the Establishment Clause or not. There were still, as of 2020, there were still something like 37 states that had Blaine amendments in their constitution. Utah was one of them. And so there was a series of cases in the early 2000s that went back and forth that said, well, in some cases, state funds are appropriate to go to schools if, for example, they're given to parents, and then the parents choose. If it's for, in a case Locke v. Davey, if we're giving out playground resurfacing grants, right? If you have a religious school and you're giving it to other private schools, they said you can't specifically say that religious school doesn't get it, whereas other private schools do. But the case law was mixed. And finally, in 2017, in Trinity Lutheran, in this resurfacing playgrounds case, the court said that you couldn't specifically target a religious private school when you otherwise give a benefit to private schools generally. And a similar set of facts were upheld in Espinoza versus Montana in 2020. And Carson v. Makin is the latest iteration in this long line of cases. So I hope that gets a little bit of the historical perspective of what in history has been agreed upon, what's been disagreed upon, and then some of the history of these Blaine amendments that led to current cases and the present day. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Let's see, this is.
I had to turn mine on.
Thank you.
Not only did no one run screaming from the room last fall, you invited me back again, so it must have been successful. I also like coming to UVU, and especially to this room on a sunny day. It's such a nice place to talk about anything. So what I'm going to talk about today in my 15 minutes is the relationship of Carson versus Makin in this case to the general theme this week of pluralism. So as Dr. Burton mentioned, Maine has a program very common in states with rural areas. When there are not enough students to support a high school or even a middle school, sometimes they'll bus them to an adjoining district, but sometimes they'll just pay the tuition for them to attend a private school. Maine had such a program. There was one restriction on the tuition
and that was that the education at the private school had to be non-sectarian. So that is a bit of a term of art, but it basically means that the education had to be descriptive or informational with respect to religion and not devotional. So if you were to take, I actually have no idea if UVU teaches a course in the Bible as literature, but if you did, it would be very different from a course that one would take at BYU on the Bible. The course at BYU would be devotional. It would be assumed that the Latter-day Saint view on the Bible would be taken as normative. We wouldn't spend a lot of time wondering who really wrote the letters of Paul, which of the letters did Paul write or not write, or anything like that. And so Maine had this restriction on their program that religious schools, that is, a parent could choose a religious school for his or her children, but the religious school had to deliver primarily a non-sectarian, informational or descriptive, not a devotional education. And a parent in Maine challenged that, wanted to send his child to an evangelical school that was heavily Protestant and devotional. The court might have decided this case in a variety of ways. I mean, it might have just might have just upheld the program as it was written by the state in the statute. The state decided it didn't want to fund religious devotional education. States can't fund everything. Some states don't have medical schools. Until 25 years ago, Nevada didn't even have a state law school. Utah didn't have a dental school. And so the court might have just upheld this as a matter of funding discretion. The state had decided it doesn't want to fund religious education. If there had been enough students for a high school, the high school would have been a secular, non-sectarian education. So the state was simply providing the sort of education the student would have had had there been enough students. The state also could have struck down the program, but on much narrower, on very narrow grounds. For many years, it has been permissible for states to fund religious education under the Establishment Clause as long as it's the parent who's choosing where the funds or the aid goes to and not the state. So this is the basis for voucher programs. A state can't decide that it wants to fund a Catholic parochial school, but it can give a voucher to a parent or a guardian who can then take that voucher and spend it wherever the parent wants at any accredited school, public or private, secular or religious. So it might have decided it on that ground. It might have just said, look, the parent's going to be choosing the school. That's the circuit breaker that walls the state off from the Establishment Clause problem. And so it might have upheld it on that ground. Instead, however, the court decided it on a much broader ground, almost a radical ground. And that is, the court decided that the tuition program as a funding opportunity for private schools, and that the exclusion of sectarian religious schools, devotional religious schools from this funding opportunity constituted discrimination, unconstitutional discrimination under the Free Exercise Clause. That was a big move for the Supreme Court, although it wasn't really an unexpected one, because the year before it had actually laid the groundwork for this kind of move in public education. So this involves the case of Fulton versus City of Philadelphia. The City of Philadelphia, like most municipalities and states, has a very extensive program of foster care for children who have lost their parents or whose parents have lost their parental rights and so on. And it's all funded by the city, all funded with government money. And the City of Philadelphia enacted an anti-discrimination condition. If you want to participate in their foster care program, you can't discriminate on the basis of race or on the basis of sex or on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity. Catholic Social Services in Philadelphia sued the city for religious discrimination. It argued that the city's anti-discrimination provision constituted discrimination against Catholic Social Services because their theological, because Catholicism prevented them from certifying same-sex couples as acceptable foster parents. Now, again, in one sense, the city's discrimination provision shouldn't have been controversial at all. If you want to discriminate on the basis of race or LGBTQ orientation or sex, you can do it privately with your own money. But if you want to take the government's money, then you have to abide by the government's conditions, as long as they're reasonable, and certainly an anti-discrimination provision is reasonable. The Supreme Court, however, saw it another way, very much the way it saw the program in Carson versus Makin. It held that the city's funding for foster care was a funding opportunity, and excluding Catholic Social Services from this funding opportunity constituted unconstitutional discrimination under the Free Exercise Clause. So if you think about it, I mean, you shouldn't think about it too long because it'll give you a headache. It doesn't make any sense. The city passes an anti-discrimination provision, and Catholic Social Services says, no, we don't have to abide by that anti-discrimination provision. We can discriminate against other people, but you can't discriminate against us. As weird as that sounds, that's how the case ended up. So that's where we end up in Carson versus Makin. So what does this mean more broadly, and especially for the theme of the session today on pluralism? I mean, who doesn't like pluralism, right? Everybody likes pluralism. Difference, diversity, but again, when we think about it, pluralism can't be unlimited. I mean, the Ku Klux Klan contributes to pluralism, right? It's a different view about race relations, and but obviously that's not the sort of pluralism that we want to encourage. We can multiply those kinds of exemptions, of examples. And historically in the United States, we have differentiated between pluralism in private and pluralism in public. You have much more ability to be different if you're in your living room than if you're in a public school. When you're in a public school, you have obligations to the public, and included among those is non-discrimination. But if you're sitting in your living room, of course, you can decide who comes in the door, and you can discriminate on any basis you wish, including bases of discrimination that we believe are blameworthy today. In public, one would expect the attractiveness and the popularity of ideas and movements and groups to rise or fall based on that intrinsic attractiveness. We think of it as a free marketplace of ideas. That is a free marketplace that is not distorted by government intervention. Now, however, the Supreme Court has set up or has laid the foundation for a system in which not only may government fund religious education and religion more broadly, but in many circumstances, it will be found liable for unconstitutional religious discrimination if it fails to fund it. I will leave for Ms. Tucker the implications of that for public education, but they're profound and, as I mentioned at the beginning, radical. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to be on the panel, and for my American Heritage students that are here, that they know me as their professor, but I also head the nonprofit, the Utah 3Rs Project. So I wanted to give a little background to that because it directly relates to public school. So the Utah 3Rs Project, the 3 Rs are rights, responsibility, and respect, and specifically the right of conscience. So we train teachers and develop resources for students and for the teachers to teach students about a constitutional approach to religion in a public school. So for the first R, the right of conscience, understanding that we all have inherently the right of conscience, and that the ability to decide morally what we believe is right and wrong. And then in addition, it's not just knowing your own rights, it's feeling a responsibility to protect that right in others and other people. So it's not just having your way being the right way, but understanding that everybody is on this own journey with their own conscience. And then lastly, that the last R is respect, or respect the freedom to disagree. There's lots of different ways of understanding the right of conscience, or understanding what a God, your God, or somebody else's, what they believe is God, what their responsibilities are. And specifically for conscience, happens privately, but then you also have a right to play it out in society, to live your conscience out in society, not just keep it privately. So this relates to when we do trainings with teachers. What is this framework set up by the Free Exercise Clause and the Establishment Clause? As a public school teacher, how do you respect that right of conscience? But as a public school representative, how are you constrained? So one of the basic ways that we approach this is that every American student, that because a public school reflects a microcosm of the broader public square, meaning it's a small version of what's happening, as long as there are religious people in school or people who are pursuing their conscience, that the public school can be a very religious place. That because under the Free Exercise Clause, students can pray on their own, they can form groups to pray, they can bring their religious texts to school, they can wear their religious clothing to school, and if it's not disruptive for class, they can talk about their religious views, and that as long as they are acting on their conscience in school, that they are protected by the Free Exercise Clause, and that as a teacher, a public school teacher, you should not constrain their free exercise as long as it's not disruptive for instruction. On the other side, we also train teachers that under the Establishment Clause, that you are a representative of the state, meaning that you need to be neutral toward religion, and meaning that not to favor one religion or another. And as Professor Gedicks talked about, that the teachers cannot be devotional in how they talk about their religion. So if they believe Jesus Christ is the way to salvation, they can't use the opportunity for their classroom to preach that particular belief. That they could say some people, they have to have an academic approach to religion. That they could say some people believe this about the Bible, and so that the students are prepared to then go into the world understanding that some people in their society and in their communities believe this particular point of view. So this approach to the establishment clause, that the teachers are constrained from a devotional approach, is a reaction to several Supreme Court cases in the 60s related to school prayer, and the school was teaching school prayer, which Dr. Burton referenced, and it was a Protestant approach to prayer, and so some parents who were Jewish didn't want their students going to this public school, their children going to this public school, to be constrained to learn how to pray in this Protestant way, because they wanted to teach their children to teach in their Jewish tradition. And the same way there was Bible instruction from the school. So that's one component of the establishment clause, that we teach teachers or train teachers that they need to be constrained in that way. Another component of the establishment clause is related to this case, is where the government is funding religion, or when there's government funding, is it promoting religion because of the funding that's going to support religion? So there's been some other cases where, especially in 1973 with Lemon v. Kurtzman, which created a test of how do we know if it's violating the establishment clause, then in that case, the government was giving money directly to support some Catholic schools, as long as the classes in the Catholic schools were for a secular purpose. And so, but that was struck down and said, you can't do that. So, but then in some other cases, as long as the money was going to the parents, then it did not violate this establishment clause. Several cases related to that. And that's the situation in Carson v. Makin, that because a voucher program was created in Maine in the 1880s, Maine and Vermont, because these areas were very rural and there weren't enough children to be able to attend a public school. So they started that the taxes that you pay, the money that comes from taxes, because we don't have a public school to support this, then they would give the money to the parents, and then they could send their child to whatever school that they deemed appropriate. But then later there was a statute added that this cannot be a religious school. So because of this case, and as Professor Gedicks referenced, that the Supreme Court recently has prioritized more the free exercise clause over the establishment clause, and because the money is going to parents, then there's no longer this constraint of whether these vouchers, which is tax money, then going back to parents, that there's not the constraint of whether they go to religious schools. So this is a trend. There's been several other cases, and as Dr. Burton mentioned, this is the latest case in this trend of giving this priority to the free exercise clause, of allowing this tax money to then go to support private religious schools, as long as it's through the parents. So I think one of the greatest implications for us in Utah is that, as Dr. Burton mentioned, there are these Blaine amendments in several different state constitutions. Well, Utah doesn't have a Blaine amendment. Its constitution was being created about the same time, and because of the Congress' fear of a union of church and state in the state of Utah because of the influence of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, they delayed in allowing Utah to become a state. And so eventually they were able to work out a constitution that they could agree with, and explicitly in the Utah state constitution, it prohibits allowing public money to go to funding any sectarian schools or public schools. So it says that no public money will support sectarian schools, meaning a particular religious school, and that no government funding can aid religious educational institutions, and that there's no religious test for teachers or students in public schools. So this is from the 1895 Constitution that was adopted, and we became a state in 1896. So constitutionally we have this, but just recently in the legislature, there was a passage of HB 215, which gives money to allow students to fund, or allows parents to have tax money to then use a voucher for a private school. And in this new bill that now is a law, that they didn't put any constraints on whether it could be a religious school, and they didn't put any other constraints of accountability or other limits on who can get the vouchers. It's just the first 5,000 parents who apply are eligible for this new voucher. And so this has been really controversial. People have a lot of strong feelings about the implementation and the priority of whether this voucher program is necessary or should be applied in Utah. And so because it violates essentially right now the Utah state constitution as it stands, there's room for possible litigation, but at the same time, there's these several recent Supreme Court cases, including Carson v. Makin, where the court decided that these vouchers are okay, that they don't violate the Establishment Clause because it would be religious discrimination or viewpoint discrimination based on the religion of the parents if they were denied the opportunity to use these tax money vouchers to then support the education of their child that goes to a religious school. So I think that there could be litigation about it, but they probably would lose if they're trying to challenge it. I think that it would likely be able to be upheld based on if it went up to the Supreme Court, and that this court has decided more and more to prioritize the free exercise clause, and that teachers more and more will have leeway in public schools to be able to allow more of an expression of their personal religion in their role as a public school teacher than they would have been allowed to do and would have been constrained to do more in the 80s and 90s and early 2000s.
Okay, thanks to each of you. We're going to take a break for just under 10 minutes. Then we'll come back for Q&A, which I hope you have many questions for our panelists. If there is pizza left over, feel free to grab it.
So in the fall I was an adjunct, but now I am.
Oh, good.
I'm on. Robert's my supervisor actually.
She's joined the team, which is great.
So you have an American Heritage class? Is that a required course?
Awesome, guys.
It fulfills the institution's requirements. State legislature.
The other one was the Civil War one. That was a good one. I thought that was really good. All right, man. All right. Yeah, you too. Next week and chat it up. Yep.
Where do we sign in?
There you are. should probably talk about it. That's one of the people that Richard was supposed to talk about the workshop. So, that's just out of the
Yeah, one thing, well, you were, but for the first time, kind of feels just surprised.
Yeah. Well, you had two rough days. You had fire alarm yesterday. And I'm so sorry I wasn't here. I know that's probably it was okay. I feel like I was even thinking to myself today that I wouldn't mind if I was director of it because I was like, it would be kind of my first time and I feel like it's okay to let it be something that's just present.
I filmed it.
But yeah, and then I also got the recording from other meetings. But I personally, my only takeaway was just like, I didn't realize how shaky I would be. I thought I could do that on my own, but once I tried, I like pulled up the document of like how to. I was like, I forgot like a few crucial steps here, which makes it not possible for me to finish this process.
Randy, that's my partner Josh is also with
Randall's fault.
To make sure that
Let me make sure we don't need to touch your pizza in a hand.
because I had like three of the steps up.
Having a conversation.
Laptop. Yeah, maybe mine isn't set up. Because we could go over that. Yeah, I think maybe I was teaching world history. Black magic device.
French imperialism in Vietnam.
On it. Yeah.
French imperialism.
I was really worried, but
Hopefully we'll get to the present by the end of this month. Frantic race to the end.
Good luck.
You think one,
I might be.
you think well, one of them, but just to find what we mean when we say liberalism.
No.
Okay.
Yeah.
that's what I was trying
I was
to get them
meeting
to
in my
say.
office.
One of them does.
I can't imagine this would be too long.
So Richard said that's not.
I have a leadership speech. I completely forgot to tell people that I had been present in the deaf class in the beginning,
I don't
so
think
then
we
we
need to
started going into it.
Did he drive? He drove it.
No.
Yeah.
I read
He
it.
said it's totally
I thought the same thing.
I would be so shaky.
Thanks for your help, by the way.
Oh yeah, no worries. Thank you for helping.
Yeah.
I had the definition on my computer, and they were familiar with the questions on the paper, so it felt kind of redundant to say it.
Take care.
But I'm sure the audience could benefit from more clear definition. I just was kind of asking them to define it at the same time.
Yeah, that's
So like,
you know,
I didn't want to be like,
that's
let me
kind
answer
of
my own
what
question.
we're talking about is what is known as so yeah, you don't want to just define stuff rigidly.
And then be like, what do you mean this?
You're kind of begging the question if you do that. I just think it was mostly quick just for people that are super into this sort of stuff, like the people that were just here for like clicks and values.
I'm not even super familiar with the terms. Like to me, I was surprised when I first heard it because I didn't know that liberalism was like this broader.
Do you feel like they got to like kind of what you were wondering about this whole thing?
There was a good discussion, but I think the real answers to all questions are more like personal answers.
They take a personal answer?
Yeah, like I have to be the one that answers the questions for myself.
Oh,
So I wouldn't have guessed it's like, no, I'm done talking about it with anyone. But I do feel like they answered it since it was a good discussion.
yeah. I wonder if it seems hard or like just do they feel like they're compromising?
Okay, welcome back. Our numbers are fewer, so anyone who wants to come forward a little bit for a more intimate conversation certainly may. So if I can start with the first question, it's directed toward Fred. I think think the students here would be interested to know how the recent Supreme Court nominations and confirmations have shifted the sensibility of the court, right? Or that shifted the center of the court on some of these issues that have been long-standing issues behind the scenes.
That's a good question. I want to know that too.
Well, I was going to say, it shifted the court to the right, but I think maybe more than that, it shifted the court to a more activist, conservative court than before. So the institutionalist, the conservative institutionalist on the court is Chief Justice Roberts. He cares about the reputation of the court, seems to care about precedent. He doesn't like to move too far too fast. But there are 5 now conservatives who are loaded for bear. Well, at least 3 of them are. Justice Gorsuch, Justice Alito, and Justice Thomas. It's almost as if they've been caged for so long, and now they have the majority, and they're ready to remake the doctrine of the court. Although, having said all that, ironically, Carson versus Makin was authored by Chief Justice Roberts, and it's not an institutionalist decision. It's a more radical decision, so it's a little unusual for him. I think the nomination and confirmation that really made the difference was Justice Barrett for Justice Ginsburg. I mean, Justice Barrett is a staunch conservative, and Justice Ginsburg was probably the most liberal member of the court before she passed away.
So you said some things there that struck me like, well, Chief Justice Roberts is this great guy, and he did this really unusual thing, but I don't think it was unusual. I think it's the plan, and he just has an image, and he does what he wants to do. And I agreed with Brian and listening to you guys. All I thought was, we have a tyrannical court that doesn't represent the population of the country, and they're enforcing a minority view with very, very sketchy, problematic reasoning. That, like, some of the reasoning I heard made me think, well, if the Catholics can DQ or same-sex couples, what are the limits on my freedom to discriminate? And where is that going to be reined in? And how is that not going to go farther? And can we do, like, I basically, at this point, I feel hopeless. I feel that the Supreme Court is unchallengeable for the rest of my lifetime and probably my children's lifetime, and that this country will not represent anything that I value in 10 or 20 years of their rule. And I mean rule. And I think you can see similar things in the states, like Utah trying to limit the right of its court. We have conservative legislatures trying to take power from courts, limit the right of the courts, and the Supreme Court is just another piece of this. So I don't even know I don't know what we're doing here if we can't fix the Supreme Court, and I don't know how to fix the Supreme Court.
Well, let me first say, I'm a member of the ACLU, so you're preaching to the choir. But I don't think, I mean, you and I, we're in the position of conservatives in the 1960s and 1970s. Conservatives were saying exactly the same thing. The Warren Court was out of control. It didn't represent the will of the people, especially with respect to the Establishment Clause, the very separationist decisions. And then Earl Warren finally steps down, and they get Warren Burger, a Nixon appointee, and he turns out to be not much of a conservative. Certainly not what people expected. But, over time, the court shifted, and not in my lifetime, but I would expect in, 30 years, we'll have something different.
You think there's hope for that? For real?
I mean, first of all, the Supreme Court is not a representative body in the way that the House of Representatives is, or even the Senate. It's not supposed to be, it's not an elected body. And yeah, history suggests that, you know, the pendulum swings back and forth on the court, and it'll swing back. You look young enough to me to have hope, you know. It won't swing back for me. I'm going to be 70 in 2 months, so I don't think in 20 years I'm going to see even a moderate court, although maybe a moderate court. It depends on how long they live and who's elected president.
What do you think about things like not just the plausibility or possibility of term limits for the Supreme Court or something like that to deal with these issues?
I think that's dead on arrival. I think that, I mean, we're sort of branching out from the topic here. I just think that the Republicans would not see that in their interest right now, and so it's not even going to get, I mean, you need 2/3 to get a constitutional amendment out of each house of Congress. That's just not going to happen.
Okay, I don't want to derail us too much. I do want to emphasize that I feel like the court situation is the core factor, and I'm not sure what the other options we have are outside of that.
Politics.
Robert or Eleesha, do you want to weigh in on this?
Do you want to?
I don't have anything to say.
At least for the sake of discussion, I think it's worth considering. There's a good argument to be made that this decision isn't quite as radical as it may appear to be. And this is a place where I think Professor Gedicks and I might disagree. But I mean, the basic, well, I guess two thoughts. One is, in general, religion has been treated uniquely in law for a long time. So even something like the Civil Rights Act, something that prohibits discrimination on the basis of religion, has an exemption saying that churches can, which makes sense, right? If you don't want the state meddling with who becomes your pastor, churches should have the ability, or religious schools should have the ability to say, we want a Catholic to lead our Catholic school, or we want our, a rabbi to lead our rabbinic school, or whatever. And so religion presents a unique set of questions and concerns, and also benefits. And so, looking to whether it was the Fulton decision or this decision, Carson v. Makin, religion just has been treated as something unique that in ways where the goal may not be discrimination, but the living out of a religious belief, and therefore that should be treated in a particular way under the law. And so there is a free exercise in the Constitution. There isn't a non-discrimination clause in the Constitution. So at least on constitutional grounds, it wouldn't be unreasonable for religion to be treated a little bit differently than other things. I think the basic premise is, at least again, worth considering in the realm of opinions we've been discussing, is the state of Maine wasn't required to give private schools vouchers. But one argument would be, if you are going to give it to private schools, you can't single out religious schools without being a kind of religious discrimination that the First Amendment prohibits. Again, that takes a particular understanding of the Establishment Clause and a particular understanding of the Free Exercise Clause. But looking at the cases that were before over the last 20 years, I don't know if I personally would use the word radical to describe it. A shift back to history and tradition and what the practice has been, in some ways, can only be radical if there's been a big change in the interim, right? At least I think that's worth considering.
We have a question over here.
Hi, thank you for all these insights. I'm curious how this relates to higher education and what kind of ripple effects that these decisions and issues might have in the realm of colleges and universities.
I take that.
That is a good question. I don't think that it has as much of an implication because this is for vouchers for K-12, and as long as higher ed, that there's still the constraint of having the responsibility to teach religion in an academic way, but there's more sensitivity and triggers around children because they are more influenceable, and parents are more protective of what kinds of ideas that they're being exposed to. But at the higher ed level, there's more of a liberty to be able to be exposed to a lot more different ideas, and so there's not so much that sensitivity for funding for what the parents go to a particular school. But at BYU, there are some. I don't know how much this case would impact it, but that if there's criticism about any public funds going to support religious schools, there has been criticism of not directly getting funds for religious institutions, but if it's going directly to the student itself, like through Pell Grants and other things that are funded, then that's a point of possible criticism of discontinuing that sort of thing. But again, with this court, I don't think that would be upheld, but you would be able to speak to that much more.
No, I agree with you.
I can speak to that just a little bit, Jenna. So, as Eleesha said, there's unlikely to be a direct impact of Carson v. Makin on higher education, right, given, right, the history and culture and the way higher education is governed. But that doesn't mean that there aren't reasons to be concerned about the integrity of religious studies and the academic study of religion in public higher education. But it would more likely be the case that it would come through a process like what we're seeing in Florida, right, with the effort to apply pressure on higher education boards and administrations to regulate, right, curriculum at that level. That's how I would see it.
So my question is more of a question of understanding because I don't know all everything around it. So when it comes back down to the First Amendment and just religious freedom, would the government ever provide money, let's say for if there was some religious institution that did not have funds but had a lot of backing and a lot of people, and the people are asking for money to be able to freely worship and receive money to create almost an institution. Would that ever be applicable, or would it be viewed as a business? Because I know small businesses receive money from the government to be able to establish themselves. Would a religious institution ever be looked at in that direction either? Does that make sense?
That's sort of a broader question maybe than you thought you were asking. In general, religious organizations can apply for public funds and receive them as long as they qualify on the same basis as secular organizations. So if I want to start a religious school and there's some state startup money or maybe a small business loan, I think religious schools are eligible for those as long as they qualify on the same basis as everyone else. Now, if we move from school to actual worship, like a chapel or a pastor or something like that, that's the part of the Establishment Clause that is still standing. It would be would be an obvious and clear violation of the Establishment Clause. That is, it would be an establishment of religion for the state to fund places of worship and pastors or clerics or folks like that to fund their compensation. Now, there are a few borderline cases, so there have been a lot of churches in the United States are landmarked as, places of special heritage. And occasionally states and the federal government will allocate money for the refurbishing of historical landmarks. Is a chapel eligible for that? It's actually a line of cases, and I don't know the answer. I'm not familiar with those cases. I do think that the funding, the way they tend to come out, I think, is that you can't use the money to refurbish your altar, but you could put in new windows. Something that's quintessentially religious can't be funded by the state, but something like a door or a window or the roof or something like that, even on a chapel. I hope that's responsive to your question.
It seems from the first question we had and the way you responded that it just prompts, this. Tocquevillian analysis would say, mores trump laws, right? And what I hear going on here in our country is that we're playing at the court levels with deep shifts in mores. A true pluralistic society is developing in our country at the level of not just religious belief, but what goes without saying, right? So many things don't any longer go without saying that we would have thought years ago, well, that goes without saying, it's not a legal matter. So I'm just curious how you see the next 20 years, 30 years. The court, it's conservative now. Why not say, you hinted at it, there's always politics. But below politics, there's always religion. There's always proselytizing for your worldview, right? We tend to think religion is just these chapels down the street. But it's really today a massive question of contestation between deep differences on what it is to be human and what's this all about. It sets our priorities, and then we start thinking about laws. So I'm just curious whether you see shifts in our mores happening so radically that the population just says, forget what the Supreme Court says. We don't care what the law is. We're going to live this way, and effectively, politically coming back in and changing things that way. I don't mean it so radically as forget it, but almost, let's drive on the left side, right? And if everybody does it, to heck with the Supreme Court.
Just to start anyway. There's a lot of political scientists who have wasted far too much ink on the question of, do shifts in views come before the court, or does the law tend to follow the views of the people? And I think the consensus is over time that there's some exceptions to this, but over time, overall, Tocqueville was right. The law tends to eventually follow the views of people. But to the bigger question about the contestation, I think one of the things Professor Gedicks said is really important, and that's that we do have the free exchange of ideas, right? So as we become more divided, differ more on kind of fundamental philosophical, ethical questions, theological questions, or questions with theological implications, it's all the more important that we have the freedom and ability and culture, so both the legal and the culture, such that we can contest those ideas in public and have that exchange of ideas, that market of ideas, right, in the public sphere.
Where does that happen? In other words, that's an interesting question. If it doesn't happen in the universities, does it happen on the internet? You see what I'm getting at? Where does it really
You wanna
happen?
take this one?
Yes, it happens on the internet.
Yeah.
Like,
Not everywhere on the
unsuccessfully.
internet.
Yeah.
Right. In some places.
My main response to your question was like, what will happen in the next 20 years? I think the ways people are religious is changing with the rise of the nuns, NONEs, that people that are not affiliated with a particular institution. But usually they're still religious in their own way, and that plays out. So there's more questions to be asked in the future. But I think because of our what's happening on the internet with misinformation and disinformation, that those questions that need to be asked of like how, instead of just assuming somebody is Latter-day Saint and believes certain things about Latter-day Saints or certain things about being Baptist, there's just a lot more societal accepted ways of, what do you think about this? How does your conscience play out? You may be attending this church sometimes or faithfully, but what are you doing with what is being taught for you personally? So I just think there's more room for questions, and those spaces to have those productive questions is usually not the internet, but that's where those things happen, especially right now, but in unproductive ways that are inflamed and not really representing the human dignity of how people are playing out those moments of conscience, and because it's a matter of trust. You have to have a situation where you have that sense of trust that you can tell somebody what your questions are, what you're wrestling with, or what your conscience could be, in that it could be different from theirs. And so I think intentionally with the Utah 3Rs project, our competencies are teaching about religious liberty, religious literacy, and civil dialogue. So I think one of the core skills of citizenship is helping to navigate differences with others and still respect them, because we're all living together as Americans and sharing the same public square. But if we continue to be enemies, then I'm really worried for the future of the Republic if we continue to be enemies in the way that the cable news on both sides, and then also what happens on the internet, is more the space where young people are learning how to engage with others. Like, there has to be this countercultural. So we try to teach that in schools, and but there has to be other places too. But I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Well, in a nutshell, you're not here to hear me. We do need to institutionalize this new space for the contestation of values. Mm-hmm. That is not church, that is not legislature, and that isn't even the neutral education area. We need to have a place where at least adults can go and be fully religious with each other and try to persuade each other of atheism, if that's the view. At some level, that institution is yet to form. But you're right, the internet's where it's happening, and it ain't happening well. Mm-hmm. So some form of institutionalizing a space for the contestation of values.
And that we can all agree on.
So, anyhow, that's
one last question, I think.
So with the laws going around, I want to know, do the petitions actually work? Are they empowered to make a change in those laws? Or are they a waste of time when people sign them?
I don't know what petition is.
I'm not sure what petitions you're referring to.
So just in general, if someone was to create a petition concerning the current laws.
So that'd be to your member of Congress.
Yeah, I think what politicians pay attention to is anything that affects their ability to get reelected. And so I don't know what the critical mass would be in Utah, but I would have to think that if you presented a petition of 10,000 signatures from a single congressional district to a member of Congress, that they would notice. National petitions are harder because our system is so chopped up, it's so fragmented. We have the 435 members of Congress, we have the states, and then the Electoral College among the states. But I think anytime you get a lot of signatures, a lot of people putting themselves on record for a particular thing, that politicians pay attention to that if they perceive that it would affect their ability to get reelected.
We have time for one more, perhaps. Yeah.
I don't know if this is too abstract, but do you think that maybe an argument against the HB 215 legislation is that it could limit students' exposure to a pluralistic society? So because everyone's going to private schools that support their religious traditions, they don't see anyone else's religious traditions, and then does that diminish the free exercise clause that we've written into the Constitution that the founders loved? Does that diminish it? Does my question make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think in terms of an argument, that's not really strong against it, because most of the freedom of choice in education parents are I don't want other people exposing their ideas in what Dr. Paul called a contamination of ideas during his session. It's it's more of a cultural reaction for many of them. In many cases, it's more of a cultural reaction that I see where the world is going, and I want to send my child to a school that reflects my religious values. Is that so? I'm a really religious person, but I also have the value of that. I think I would teach my family that we can have our own values, but we still need to live in a world with other people who are different from us and to respect their conscience too. And yeah, maybe we probably think they're wrong, in the long-term eternal perspective, but that we still need to live together and to understand others and to respect their human dignity. And so but that's a reflection of what I've done with my own religious values. And so, but in terms of an argument under the free exercise clause, I think that's more of a parental rights question of what you want for your child and what you want for their education, and not so much a protection under the religion clauses of the First Amendment. So unless you...
Yeah, I have a quick addition. Historically, that was a big argument against Catholic schools. John Dewey and others were very much in favor of having the schools that became kind of laboratories for democracy, right? So this idea that your schools were helping to shape democratic citizens in a way that was good for democracy, and that Catholic education was pulling them out of that and therefore was bad for citizenship. I think there is an argument to be made that if the vast majority of your students are in public schools, that if the goal is really diversity, then having someone be able to be shaped in a meaningful way in the religious tradition may actually be adding diversity to the overall population than it is otherwise. So there's tons of state schools around the world, around the United States. There are very few Jewish yeshiva schools. So someone going to a Jewish yeshiva law school is actually going to contribute to the overall diversity in legal education than someone else who goes to just another state school. So I think there's an argument to be made that actually overall diversity is benefited by having these particular institutions where people can be formed in that way.
Thank you.
Well, that puts us right at the hour. Thank you all for staying. Thank you for a really high quality session, and please join me in thanking our panelists.
Well, that was fun. Yeah.
Have a great weekend.
That was great, you guys.
Thank you.
It was nice
Thank
having
you so
questions
much.
this time.
So, Eleesha, I was, the time I first heard the term nuns, I was at Notre Dame surrounded by a bunch of priests.
Well, we had a little,
and I was in this lecture, they kept talking about the rise of these secular nuns. The nuns and the religions. I got so confused.